In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the continuation of Skydomes in Unreal Engine 4. So we're going to just be basically adding on to the complexity of what we've already taken a look at. We've already looked at how to take the cloud textures and move them around, actually get a more complicated setup where the clouds go in front of the sun disk. The sun disk actually updates via the blueprint. Now we're going to be taking a look at how to set up color customization so you can interactively change colors on the sky, and then also if you wanted to put your own custom texture in the sky for some image for a sun or a moon, we'll take a look at that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and open up the material instance that was created from the parent material, and let's look at some of the different controls on here. So we've got something on here that controls the gradient of the sky at the top and then the gradient of the sky at the bottom. And then we also have two different controls for the color of the clouds that you see in here. We also have a little bit of the background contrast and the gradient at the top. So you can see I've added this ability to kind of hide some of the clouds that are at the very, very top of the sky dome. And so we'll be looking at all those different pieces. Now, if we go through and you click and you can change some of the options for this. So if we wanted to start to introduce different color types on here, we're able to do that. And I'll go ahead and push this up a little bit, make the saturation of this, and maybe make it a little bit darker like this here. You'll notice maybe that secondary color isn't having so much of an effect. You do have to watch out for the things that were added to the scene. So we do have this exponential height fog that we looked at, and we also have this atmospheric fog as well that added some color to this. So you can see if we turn off the exponential height fog, it has quite a bit of an effect on this thing here. So if we take a look at this, if you're going to use this in conjunction with your colors, you're going to need to think about how colors maybe work and harmonize with this thing. So because the sun is over here, we've got this directional in scattering color that we have, and if we push this away from the red towards the green that we have for this, you can see what kind of an effect that we'll get for this. We also have the color at the horizon, and we might have to kind of tweak that to maybe work a little bit better with this. So it really all kind of depends on the look that you're going for on these things. And there are rules for colors and how you harmonize colors together and things like that. We won't really be getting into that, but I just want you to be aware that if you do have the exponential height fog, that is going to have an effect over the overall colors that you have within here. So if you want, you can just go ahead and turn that whole thing off, but it is going to expose the mirrored kind of sky dome technique that we looked at earlier. So let's get into the meat of this material, and we'll go ahead and close this thing up right here. So here is the parent material, and let's open this up and take a look at the setting that we have for this. So it is pretty close to what we had before, but there are some additional things that have been added. So you can see here's the old sun vector and the sun setup that we took from the original Epic blueprint. We also have our sky dome, the panning speed, everything's set up the same for that. But then now we're starting to introduce some of these different things for color. So because I'm starting to take this map that you see here, and I'll double click on this to open it up, which is started off as a color map. What I want to steal from this is kind of the information that you see as far as like shading goes from this. So just keep in mind this is kind of what the color map looks like. It's not too saturated, so there's not a whole lot of color in here. So I think that's probably why this maybe works fairly decent. But you can see what we have here is I'm inversing the map. So if we take a look at this, start to preview the node here. Here's what we've got for the color. And then if we go here and I start to preview this -1, it's kind of inverting all the values. So all the whites that we had before along the clouds are now darker. The clouds were a little bit lighter, and it's kind of giving them this value here. Now this does produce this funky kind of color that you see here. Also go ahead and stop previewing that. This was actually a -1 node, so if you just type in minus or something like that, you'll find that node. It basically takes whatever value you have and inverts it. And then this node here is a desaturation node. So you just type in desat and you can get the desaturation. This will actually take any color information that you have and it's going to suck all the color out of it. So I'm taking this color map, inverting it, and then desaturating it to get this black and white map that you see here. And so from here, what we're doing is feeding this into these different slots again. So we've got parameter nodes that we had for color. So again, if you just hold down 3 and tap, that's going to give you a constant vector 3, which you can right click and say convert to parameter. And so you can give that a name. And then once you do that, it's going to kind of produce this node that you see here. It's going to have the red, green, blue, the alpha, and then RGB out. So we just pipe this into the A slot, and then this color is piped into the B slot. Now the alpha for this is being driven by this color map that we've inversed and desaturated. So what it's setting up is basically, wherever it's white like this, or black, sorry, it's going to actually show through and expose these different colors in the different ways. Let's just go ahead and say start previewing this on here. So you can see wherever it was black before, it's actually going to draw this pink color, and wherever it was pushed more towards white, it's going to fill with this color right here. So this is basically tinting the entire sky dome at this point. Okay, so that's going to give the color for the sky, for the clouds. But we do need some controls for the gradient for the background that we see here. So this is what was done within here. So there's actually a linear gradient. So if we just type in LIN, you should be able to find this linear gradient right in through here. And this is going to give you a black and white gradient. And you can tell it to go from U gradient or V gradient. U is going to go around in this direction, and then V is going to go up and down. And so if we just start to preview this, we can see some of the color. Let me tap F and then get all the way out of here like this. So we can see this here. If we pipe, actually it's not going to give us the accurate representation of this because we're just viewing just this node here. So if I go to the next node over, which is a power node, we can see what we've got here. Okay, so this power node actually takes the value of this thing and kind of cranks it and builds up something that's kind of like contrast on there. And with the power node, you're able to pipe in a value into that, and you can just leave it if you want, but I created a parameter of it, so I just typed 1, hit this here, and then convert to parameter, and then gave it a name. So then that way I've got some controls within the material instance on how strong or light this gradient actually is. Okay, so this is the black and white area that gets fed into the alpha for this linear interpolation node. We looked at a linear interpolation node in the last video, and it was talking about basically you've got a slot A and B, and A sits over the top of B, and depending on what is fed into it as far as a black and white map or a black and white value, it'll let A show through with B underneath of it. And so you can see with this this gradient that we've got going on here, basically the whole thing would be blue, but then since we're introducing this white value, it's letting this pink show through at the bottom down here. And so if I just right click on here and say start previewing node, you can see what that's going to kick out for us for this gradient. So this gives us some control of a gradient in the world that we can use, and we've got this setup where we can kind of control the amount that this is showing through on here. So this is the part where we actually get the clouds to draw over the top of this gradient. So if you remember what we just looked at here, we're piping out the textures, and we're getting this color, and we're feeding it over the top of this. So if we start previewing this thing again, you can see that it's going to tint the entire world. We just want to grab the clouds, and then we want this gradient, and we want the clouds over the top of the gradient. So we're piping the out of this area here into this new linear interpolation node, and we're piping it into the A slot because we want the clouds to sit over the top of the gradient. Here's the out of the gradient going into the B slot, and then now we've got an alpha on here. So let's just start previewing this, and then we can see what we've got going on here. So this texture map, if you remember from last video, when we looked at the map inside of Photoshop for this thing, we have in the alpha channel a black and white map. So we've got the clouds that are kind of blacked out here. The middle clouds are this light kind of gray, and then the background's white. So let's hop back on over here. So the alpha of that is fed into this linear interpolation node that you see here. So this is what we're getting out of that setup right now. And then we need to add back in our sun. So if you remember, we had our sun vector, this sun area, and then we did this whole thing where we added the sun into this thing. So if I start previewing this, we have to rotate around and actually find the sun. If you remember from that earlier setup, we've got our whole sky kind of set up with the sun, and it's being added over the top of that, which produces this effect where the clouds don't look like they're actually sitting over the top of the sun anymore. Now, something interesting, just the way this is set up, I could have taken the sun and added it with the gradient, and I don't think we would have had to worry about an additional setup, but I just went ahead and did it this way, where if we take a look at this now, basically I'm taking the out of this, the adding of the sun, and pushing it under there, and putting the clouds over the top of it, and then taking this part of the map and blending it with it. I'm not sure exactly if that really made all that much of a difference, but here's where it really kind of made a bigger difference, is running the out of this right here. This is the background with the clouds sitting over the top of this, and then we've got the background with the sun added into the B slot, and then again we're using the alpha of that texture into this linear interpolation node. And the last part of this material is, if we kind of zoom in on this area and kind of look over in this part here, I called it this final composite of nodes, and it's basically everything that we took a look at, and we pipe it into the B slot, and I want this gradient at the very top of the Skydome to blend over the top of this. So what I did was kind of hijack this color that we had here for the clouds, and I piped that in right into the top of this A slot of the linear interpolation node. So this thing, this color sits over the top of everything, and then the world sits underneath of it, and then we're getting this part, another gradient, to blend this thing out. And so I wanted another setup, basically like what we looked at before. We're using a linear gradient, and we got this power node, and then we've got a value that we can drive dynamically in the world with that value plugged into the alpha. And the result of everything else is piped into the emissive for this thing. So again, we'll close this thing up, and we will take a look in the world, and then maybe now when we look at this material instance of this thing, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense as to what we're looking at. So I'm going to close that part down a little bit so we can see in the world a little better, and then drag this thing out here. So again, here's all those different parameters that we set up for ourselves. We have the sky color 1 and 2, which is actually the colors of the different parts of the clouds. So let's do this here and make this like this other color here. maybe go right through there with this. And then we also have the sky, the gradient at the bottom, which you can do something like this here, and then the gradient at the top of the sky dome here. So again, depending on what kind of color combinations that you're trying to blend together with each other, you can get those. The other thing that we had this background gradient, the contrast on it. So if I crank that up, you can see how that gradient starts to fall lower, and if we lessen it like that, we can really change how much that falls down and through there. The other thing that we have is the top gradient here, and if we overdrive that, then we can really start to hide those clouds that go up into the top of this thing here, like we see there. So this is the settings for all this. Again, if we wanted to get back to default values, we could click these buttons in through here like this, and we'll go ahead and save that and then close that down. Like I said, I did notice that just clicking on these reset values, it's kind of odd that you have to hit enter on some of these things for actually changing the value to get some of those things to come through like that. So if I just came through and lightly tapped on some of these things, I think it's going to set it back right there on that, right there like that. So again, I'm just going to reset everything and then go ahead and save that and close it down. So the next one we're going to be taking a look at is adding our own custom image to the sun that we see here. So again, what we're going to strive for here is being able to actually get a very similar setup to what we had before with our Sky Dome, but now we're adding the ability to add our own custom image into the world for the position of the sun. So this is the material instance for this thing. It's very similar. The only thing that's been added is now there's some texture parameters, which is just something I wanted to highlight for you guys, that you can set up a parent material. You can actually set up the textures to be dynamic. So once you have a material set up, you can just make instances of it, and you can actually swap out the textures for it. So that's something to be aware of. That's actually a pretty cool feature. So let's look at the parent material for this setup that we have here. And so the main difference that you can see here is what we had before was the vector for our sun, and actually the sphere mask was controlling the black and white mask that would actually make the sun and then the color for that. And we kind of interrupted all of that and built a new connection here. So let's go ahead and zoom in here, and you can take a look at this here. So this is what I was talking about for a sky texture, anything that you want on here that you can convert to a parameter. And if you just take one of your texture nodes and then you just right click over it, you can convert that into a new parameter, and then you can actually give it a name, and you can swap that out in a material instance just like all the other things that we're looking at before. So this thing that we're using here is called a skybox image, and you can right click and then search for that, and you can find it within here. They've got a special node for pushing an image onto your skybox that you see here. So what's a little bit different about this one is that it actually takes the image and projects it based off the coordinates that you have here. So if we just right click on here and say start previewing node, we can see what we've got. So it repeats this thing over and over again. This is where the texture slot goes into, and then it expects a vector 3 for where the position of this thing is. So it was easy to just hold down 3 and then make a constant vector, and then convert that to a parameter, and then give those some values. If you hover your cursor over this, you can see that it says the default value for this is 1, 0, and 1. So I just gave those values to this parameter there, and then plugged that in, because I knew I was going to make this into a material instance and be able to update this in the world. So the position didn't really matter all that much to me. So we also have this thing for scale, and this is expecting a vector 2. So if you just hold down 2, you can create that and convert that into a parameter as well. So on this thing, let's just get rid of this here. And we've also got this rotation, so you can actually rotate the image left or right, and this is looking for a scalar. So if you just type in scalar parameter, you can get something like that, and you can plug it in there and give it a name for this thing, or you can just do 1 and then convert to parameter. It's up to you however you want to create that thing. So that gives the different controls for this, and you can see I'm just previewing just this node right here like this. So the out of this will kick out red, green, and blue, which is what we see here, the color for this, and then it also kicks out an alpha and a mask. So if I were to just plug in just the alpha for this, it would just have part of it for the outline of this thing, but it would be repeating this this image multiple times around on the Skydome. But if we use the alpha together with a mask, then it gives us everything that we need to only have that one image in that particular placement, and it masks everything out. So that's why I took a multiply node and took the alpha and then multiplied it with the mask that you see here to get the final result of that. So if we start to preview this, you can see this is what we're going to get from this. We get just the image that we see here, and it's all blacked out in the background for that. And so this is very, very similar to what we had for the sphere mask for the sun. So the additional thing that I did was I took the texture and I multiplied it by this brightness. If you remember the setup that we had before, it was taking the sun color and then multiplying it by this brightness. So I'm doing a very similar setup for that thing. So it's getting this thing very bright. I was just using the red channel as kind of a mask for this, so it would actually be a little bit brighter on certain areas like his nose and some of these other areas and stuff like that. So it wasn't really necessary, but I just wanted to add that little bit of a mask to that. And then I'm multiplying the result of that together with the red, green, and blue of that thing. So if we take a look, it's going to be really hard to see anything because this value is so high for this right here. But if we take a look at the black and white mask that we have here in the image, combined together with the color and this brightness that we have, so I'll start previewing here. You can see this is what we're going to get here, like that. And so then this sun is again fed into this system that we've looked at already for adding the sun over the top of the clouds. So it's a very similar setup to what we had before. It's just now we're using an image for this. I'll go ahead and stop previewing this, and we can take a look at this in the world here, like that. And I'll go ahead and close this up. I'll just save some of the changes that I made to this. And so here it is in the world, and I'm just going to go ahead and save this real quick. I just saw the asterisk on there. And what I'm going to do now is open up the instance of this and show you, now that we kind of know the setup, kind of what's going on with this. So again, we could swap out our textures for a different image if we wanted to. We have this rotation that we looked at, and then that will actually rotate that image around depending on where you want it set up, like that. We have our sun brightness, which we saw the controls for that, and it was really bright in the parent material. So it wasn't the default of this, and if we set it to 100 like that, it would be really kind of blown out, but just drop that down to like 50. We still have all of our panner speed, multiply, and everything that we had before, but now what we have is this new additional thing that we looked at for the image location. And if we just open this up, we can get values for this where we can start to slide this up and down, and then we got this thing that'll push it kind of left and right. And this value here for B would actually push it up and down again, so I was just leaving that at 1 right in there. So that's going to give us the location of where this thing is at in the world. And so if I wanted to push this thing over just a little bit more like this to where I think the location of that light would be, we can get this, and then also starting to use the image rotation a little bit. So this isn't the most ideal setup for me. I'm not exactly sure what the math is behind this image. It didn't seem to behave the same way that we had for the sphere mask setup that they had. So it may be possible to actually feed some math operation in here into the image vector. I just don't know what that is currently, so if you're able to figure that out, that would be awesome to kind of know that information, because it isn't quite so fun to set all that stuff by hand. It would be much easier to have the directional light in the world kind of show that. So that's something to shoot for in that material, to try to kind of get that part working. The very last thing I want to show you is that we do have the cloud rings, and I also wanted to show you that we could actually hide stuff with the visibility on this here. And the reason it's not showing up is because there is also a actor hidden in game. So if I tap G, you can see G will hide all the controls and make it feel as if you're actually in game. And so I've got a tag on those to hide actor in the game. So I'll just untag those. And so this is the first ring of the clouds that you see here. So if I turn this on to wireframe, you can see these cards that we looked at in the very first video, the geometry that we saw inside of Maya for those clouds that just float around on a ring here. So that's what's going on with that. And let me go ahead and unhide the second ring of clouds, and then I have a third ring of clouds. So we're really starting to layer things together. So we've got everything going on from the background, and then now we're able to make some different clouds and kind of layer them as well. And so just like what we had with the Skydome, we have some controls in here for actually setting the placement and the scale of these things. You can see I scaled it a bit more in the Z dimension, and that kind of stretches the clouds and makes them taller. The scale here for X and Y will actually push them either in or out depending on the scale. So you can see the inner rings are set to a scale of 25. The second card here is set to 25, and the third one is set to 28. But I am changing the scale of Z between the first ring and then the second ring, and that's why they don't actually collide with each other or kind of intersect with each other at all, just because of the shape that we have for the geometry. The other thing that was added for this shader here is we need to go ahead and find these clouds here, and we'll take a look at this. There are some things that I thought were pretty cool about this setup that I think you might want to know, and it's having to deal with this. If you see the clouds, how they kind of distort and they kind of roll through here, everything was exactly the same with our kind of original easy setup that we had. So we have our UV coordinates going here. The only difference is we've interrupted this with an add node. So if you look at the UV coordinates, you could actually break them down into black and white coordinates that are kind of gradients going from the left to the right. So let's see if we actually got a texture coordinate. So if we do text coord and we do texture coordinate like this, I don't know if it's actually possible to look at this, but it's basically you would get two different colors, a gradient going from left to right and up and down, and that's what actually gives the UV coordinates, because it is in a flat a flat dimension like this, and it goes from a 0 to 1 space in there. So basically, knowing that, we can actually interrupt that gradient with new kind of black and white values. So by taking the values of the original UVs and then adding them together with some other new kind of colors, we can do some interesting stuff where we start to kind of have this ripple effect. And so you can see here is what I've piped into this. So let's take a look here. I'm going to pull this over here a little bit. And basically I've copied the same exact kind of setup because I actually want this black and white map that you see here. We're going to talk about this in a bit. I actually want that to have some movement as well, so it kind of has a little bit more overall kind of distortion and movement through the UVs. So I've taken this whole moving part and copied that whole thing and then piped it into this special texture that you see here. Let's hop over to Photoshop. We'll take a look at this texture and you can see this. So in Photoshop, it's pretty simple to go to any of your channels, and then you can go to filter, and then you can go to render, and then you can get clouds or difference clouds, and it will make a repeating kind of fractal kind of pattern for these clouds. And so I made something in the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, and then I put a custom texture in the alpha channel. Then that gives me the opportunity to kind of pick between the red, green, and blue for kind of this these textures that you see here. So let's hop back on over here. So that's that texture here, and that's why it looks like this weird kind of greenish blue thing. It's basically because all those different channels that I want to use are being used within this thing that you see. And so what I wanted to do was actually have those black and white values, and it's got some motion on it. Let's see if we can start to preview this node. So it's going the opposite direction of the clouds and the way that they're going, and we're seeing the red, green, and blue version right now because they're not really split out in any kind of way. So the other thing is, I'm going to stop previewing that, so we'll get this thing here. The other thing is I wanted to have something in here that would allow this to let me choose within the material instance if I was using the red channel, the green channel, or the blue channel. And so this is a mask parameter. So if we go and just type in mask, component mask, you can see with this you can actually tell it what you want to mask. Do you want to mask the alpha, the blue, the green, or the red? And you get to choose with this thing. So it's a pretty cool node. The only thing is I wanted in my map to use red, green, and blue, and the alpha. And if I piped this directly into this thing here, like this, this white represents red, green, and blue. And so if I tried to mask the alpha on here, it was throwing up an error for me because this out from this thing doesn't actually include the alpha. So to get around that, that's why I have this append node. So if I type append and we do an append vector, we can take the red, green, and blue into the A slot of this, and then the alpha into the B slot, and then that gives us everything that we need. It gives us the red, green, and blue and the alpha, and we can now pipe that into that component mask. And so then now we can mask any channel that we want, and we're able to use that. So also with the component mask, let's just go ahead and delete this here. You can actually convert that to a parameter. So that's what was done here for this thing to allow us to choose what we're going to use in this thing, if we want to use the red, green, blue, or the alpha on there. So that's what I use for this setup. I think you could find other uses for that, which is kind of cool. And this thing here was me giving some controls for saying how much do I want this black and white map to distort this thing. So the way it works is if this thing was pure black, it wouldn't give any distortion at all. It would hide the whole effect. So knowing that, I just piped the out of this into a multiply node and then gave a new parameter and give it a value of 1. So this, because it's multiplying by a value of 1, it will give us the same, it'll spit out the same exact thing of what we see here. But if we start to change that value towards 0, it'll lessen the effect or make it blacker. So that gives that control here. There's also a contrast on there. So if you remember us being able to make a power node and then giving a value on here, and giving a value of 1, everything will stay the same, and if we start changing the value towards 0 or higher, it'll start to kind of play around with that kind of contrast that we had here. The other thing I wanted to do was be able to give the ability to take each one of these channels that were being spit out of here and then be able to inverse those values. So I used a switch node, so you can right click in here and type in switch to find the static switch. And so ran the out of this to true and then interrupted it with a -1 node. So if we right click in here and say -1 it'll basically give us this value and then invert it. So if it's set to true, it's normal, and if it's false, then it will invert that with the -1. And then I just gave it a Boolean value, so we can just go static Boolean, and you could use a parameter for that, and so you can give it a name and it shows it up in the material instance, and then you get to tell it whether it's going to be true or false. So that's basically setting up a little switch condition that you see here, and then all that's fed into this B slot. So remember, here's our old UVs where it's not going to do any of the distortion stuff that we see here, and then with this added to it, we can run this through, and then now we are getting the distortion. But we've given ourselves a lot of different controls based off of this one map that we have. Again, we're being able to pick if we want to use the red, green, and blue channel or the alpha channel, you know, how much it's going to distort this thing, if we want to invert the channel and everything. So that's, you know, it might look a little bit more complicated, but I think once you get it set up and kind of start to understand how some of this works, it'll make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to close this down and not save any of the changes to that. And then now the other thing I wanted to kind of highlight is that you can make multiple material instances of your parent material, and you can make instances of an instance, which is pretty cool. So I kind of used that functionality to my advantage, to where I wanted these 3 different rings of clouds, and I wanted them to be a little bit different from each other. So the first material instance was pretty straightforward, and I'll open this thing up, and you can see now we do have the ability to basically choose if we want to use the red channel, the green channel, like what we looked at, and we can go to the blue channel. So it does kind of hide this thing, so see how it's giving a much different effect now on this thing. So that's what I was kind of aiming for, being able to produce a different effect. And you're only able to use one channel at a time right here, so the alpha channel really does some kind of funky stuff to the clouds. So depending on what that effect is, you know, I could just kind of switch through here on there like that. And then again, the UV distortion amount, if we start to push this towards something like 1, we're getting this kind of an effect. And if I pull this thing down towards 0, we got something like that. So I can kind of just pump this up a little bit depending on how much I want this thing to be affected by this and through here. And so then we also have that panner distortion contrast, so we can start to do some stuff like this. I do have to kind of raise this thing up if I want to see some of the values of this, and we can really get it to do some crazy stuff if we do this. So it just kind of depends on how far you want to kind of push this stuff. So I'll get this, and I'll raise this up just a bit. Right in through here like that. And also we do have our invert functionality there too, so we could invert the map if we wanted to. So that's the very first one, and we'll go ahead and close that up. And then now from this one, again, you can create a material instance over the top of that instance. So this second one, you can see everything will be grayed out, and then you can just expose certain things that you want to change about the cloud setup that you see in here. And so I've added an opacity amount, and I've also added this emissive color add and emissive color multiply, because I wanted the very front clouds to be a bit darker than the middle clouds, and then the back clouds to be a little bit lighter. So that's one thing we didn't look at with our material. Let's take a look at that real quick. So I'm going to open this up and then kind of come over here. So if you remember the part of our texture where we had the color kind of running out, the only thing that I did was interrupted this with a multiply, which if I feed it a color and we multiply our texture with this thing, we can actually darken something. So so let me go ahead and say that this is actually darken right here, and this would be a kind of a cool thing just to talk about. So if we have some different nodes that we're connecting together, and we want to group them together, you can actually select them and just tap C, and you can make a comment for things, and then you can click and drag them and move them around. I should have told you that a little bit earlier, but this is kind of how this is set up, and you can kind of keep things a little bit organized. So when I give it a note, whenever I multiply, you're going to take that color and it's going to tint it, but it's going to make it actually darker. When we take an emissive color that we've got, so this color here, and we do an add, anything that you do will actually do a lighten. So maybe I'll put lighten right here, like this. And so you can see now we've got some controls for this. Now, because I've multiplied it by pure white, you won't get any kind of change. And because I've added with pure black, we won't get any change here. So it just puts the controls there to where we can start messing around with some of that stuff in the material instance. The other thing that I did is that we have the alpha of these clouds, and they're pushed into opacity. This is something I should have talked about when we first looked at this material, so I'm sorry I'm coming to this a little bit late, but if we just click on here, we can see the shading model for this is still unlit, so we're not getting any kind of lighting coming from any of the lights within the scene. But we are having this not on opaque, but we have it set to translucent. So whatever we have for our alpha map will drive transparency. So that's why these clouds are mapped to a card, but you don't see any of the you don't see the card. The only thing you see is the clouds, and that's because this is coming from the alpha map on this these clouds that we have here. And we could actually take a look at that texture inside of Photoshop. So again, it's very similar to what we've got going on here, but you can see in the channels for this, everything's knocked out except for this part of the clouds. So that's why we've got this on a card and it's drawing transparent. So when you're using the translucent shading model, the translucent, we can take the alpha and plug it into opacity. But I'm overriding that, and I'm interrupting it with a multiply. So if I multiply it by 1, we don't get any kind of change. But then if we start to add this thing towards black, we can start to change the overall opacity of everything and kind of make the clouds a little bit see-through. So sorry I missed that part about the explanation at the beginning, but that gives us the controls that we are looking for this thing here. And what I was doing with those additional controls was, depending on which layer that I was drawing for the clouds, we now have this emissive color multiply, which again, I wanted the front ones to be a bit more contrast and a bit more red, so we're adding that red into there. And if we wanted to lighten them, we could do that here. So on the second ring, we can see what we've got here on this thing. We actually have made them a little bit darker, like a little more saturated with the red with the multiply, and then with the add, we're actually giving it, lightening it with this red color. So you can see how it's kind of, this is a bit brighter or lighter than this one here. And then for the very last one, we just made a material instance of this guy here. And here's what's overwritten with this. So we're just kind of doing that same thing where we're lightening these things a bit more. And what we could do is, this is still grayed out for the opacity amount. We could try to drop this down a bit. And you can see the cloud here is actually, as we push it towards black like that, it makes it more see-through. And so it'll only go from the values of 0 to 1. But I do have the ability to kind of lessen that a bit more. But I think I left it at 1 just because I wanted it to knock out the sun completely. You can see it's going to let the sun kind of bleed through on there, right there like that. So we could just set that back to the default value and set it back here. And I'll just go through and then save all my materials. But this is going to conclude this series on Skydomes, and I hope you have a lot of new kind of information and tools to set up your own custom Skydome in your world.